William Gladstone once said this: be inspired with the belief that life is a great and noble calling, not a mean and grovelling thing that we are to shuffle through as we can, but an elevated and lofty destiny. Life is a great and noble calling, an elevated and lofty destiny. Is that how it feels to you? Because let's face it, life has its ups and its downs, its high points and its lows. And during the lows, when things are really tough, then life can feel anything but a great and noble calling. So how do we cope? How do we cope with the ups and downs of life? How do we handle joy and sorrow, favour and disapproval? Can we really meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same? How can we be positive, purposeful and progressive? Being positive is, I think, something about a presumption of generosity, a sense maybe that God has endowed the world with goodness. Being positive is about knowing that God is God and that he's on our side. In our gospel reading, Jesus has been reflecting with his disciples on the nature of sacrifice. And then we're told he goes up a high mountain and takes with him Peter and James and John, his closest and most trusted friends, and he was transfigured before them. It was a vision of the glory of the Lord, but it was a vision that came not when Jesus had risen from the dead, but before his trial, before his suffering, before his death upon the cross, a temporary high point and up before the tough times that lay ahead. The anarchist writer Hakim Bey talks about a temporary autonomous zone, a kind of short-lived utopia, an opportunity to live differently, even if it's only for a moment. Maybe that is how we should think of the transfiguration of Jesus, as a temporary autonomous zone, a breaking free of all that had constrained Jesus in this earthly life, an opportunity to live differently, even if it was only for a moment. And we need these moments, these high points, if we are to inject hope into the daily struggles and trials that we face. Kester Bruin, in an excellent book called Other, says that the forces at work against us are huge, but brief festivals of hope are taking place. They are temporary flashes of light in dark places, but long after they are gone, the air hangs heavy with a generous odour, and those who think they saw something different are, in minuscule ways, penetrated by the marvellous for a second, and can never get rid of those feelings. These festivals of hope and temporary flashes of light that Kester Bruin talks about remind us that God is God. They give us a taste of God's glory, and they transfigure all that follows, even the low points and the struggles that we have to face. For Jesus, it also had something to do with affirmation. This is my Son, says God, my beloved. We need to find somewhere these flashes of light in the darkness, maybe in our times of prayer, maybe in moments of worship, maybe listening to music or reading or whatever you do that takes you out of where you are and lifts you above the muck and the mire and the messiness of life. And in those moments, receive the affirmation from God that you are his son, his daughter, and that you are beloved. We need moments such as those if we are to be positive. We need to be positive. We also need to be purposeful. In Luke's account of the Transfiguration, it says that when Jesus was with Moses and Elijah, they were speaking about his departure, his exodus, which he was about to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. Moses and Elijah talked with Jesus about his forthcoming death, but Luke uses the word departure, exodus, and you don't need to know much Old Testament to see the significance of that word. Jesus is going to bring to fulfillment a new exodus. Just as the original exodus was a saving departure, so Jesus' passing through the deep waters of death would involve once more the release of captives. Moses, in the first exodus, released those who were captive in Egypt, those who were slaves to Pharaoh. And once free, once released from bondage, they became God's people. Jesus, in this new exodus, this new departure, releases those who are slaves to sin. held captive by their own rebellion against God. Jesus releases us from bondage and makes us God's people. In a very real sense, the death of Jesus was an exodus, a saving departure. Jesus, the Son of God, and precisely because he was God's Son, felt it necessary to go to Jerusalem and to die. And God said, "This is my Son, listen to him." And time again, Jesus spoke of his death and bid his disciples to follow him. The glory of God, witnessed by Peter, James, and John, came at a price. They also had to listen to Jesus, as Jesus took them to his and to their Calvaries. Following Jesus is about listening to God, discovering God's purpose for our lives, heeding his call to follow, to offer our lives to him. We need to be positive, to be purposeful. We also need to be progressive, to look forward. These temporary flashes of light, these moments of glory are temporary. You cannot hold on to that moment forever. In the account we heard of the Transfiguration today, there's a lovely moment when the disciples don't know what to say, until Peter, their spokesman, says to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And of course, what he was asking was, can we preserve this moment? Can we stay here basking in the glory? Do we have to leave all this and let it evaporate and become just a memory? Of course, he couldn't have his shelters. The Transfiguration was a moment in time, and time moves on, and there were things to do. And we in the church, we need to learn from Peter's question and the fact that he couldn't get what he wanted. There is a terrible tendency in all our churches to want to hold on to what should be temporary and to preserve these flashes of the numinous. But as our former glories fade, we convince ourselves that what was is far better than anything that's come after. Past languages, the music of old, the way we used to do things. Oh, the glory days. So what do? We seek to preserve them, to resist moving on. Surely by resisting change, we think we can capture something of that glory. But it doesn't work like that. Gabriel Daly says of the church that hope for the future is all too easily frustrated by the dead hand of the past. When fresh insights are measured against old formularies, and when tradition, instead of being understood as a living thing, is reduced to dogmas which are entombed in the ruins of past cultures. We're all guilty of it. We're all wedded to the desire to make permanent things that should be temporary. Melba Magay, a theologian from the Philippines, says that what happens is that organizations such as the church begin as a movement, prophetic, exciting, glorious perhaps, and proceeding by new and untried means. Then things get regularized and formularized, jobs and positions of authority are given out, a structure forms, and the movement becomes a machine. And then there is the danger that if the organization loses sight of its purpose, then it becomes a monument, cold and grey and static. If we try to preserve things, if we try and cling to our former glories and the old ways of doing things, then all that we shall have left of our once glorious church will be a cold, grey, static monument. If I'm honest, then I'd have been with Peter. I'd have wanted to stay on that mountain. I'd have wanted that moment to last. But life has its ups and its downs, its high points and its lows. And no sooner had the vision faded than it was time for them to go back down from the mountain, to get back down to earth. It's a lovely expression, down to earth. The Latin for earth, humus, gives us the words humble and humility. And humility is about being down to earth and choosing the lower place. Hand in hand with the temporary moments of glory must come these acts of humility, this willingness to choose and to occupy the lower place. Of course, when Jesus and Peter and James and John came down from the mountaintop, straight away they encountered failure. Mark goes on to say later on in chapter 9, when they came to the crowd, a man brings his son to him, who's possessed by an evil spirit. He says, "I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." Life does have its ups and its downs, its high points and its lows. And here, as happens so often in my experience, Jesus and Peter and James and John move from a really great experience to one that brings them crashing back down to earth. And things from that moment are only going to get worse as Jesus is arrested and then executed in a bloody and brutal way. How did the one experience, that of seeing Jesus transfigured, relate to all that followed? How did those 3 disciples make sense of the ups and the downs and the high points and the lows of their lives? Was it, as Kester Bruin says, that long after those moments were gone, the air hung heavy with a generous odour? Did the Transfiguration give them some lasting sense of positivity and purpose and progressiveness during the very dark days that lay ahead? Maybe. And maybe there is something in all this for us. We need to seek and nurture and evoke a sense of positivity fueled by those festivals of hope and temporary flashes of light. We need to hold to a sense of purpose, listening to God and heeding his call to follow and to give ourselves up for God. And we need to be progressive, to look forwards with hope rather than cling to former glories and the old ways of doing things. If we can be positive, purposeful and progressive, then it will help us to cope with those moments when we come crashing back down to earth. Life, it seems to me, should have its ups and its downs, its high points and its lows. It's about brief encounters with glory, but it's also about patient times of humility and service and also endurance. High highs and low lows. That's what life should be, not a flat line. A flat line, says Wikipedia, is a measurement that shows no activity and is often involved in various definitions of death. Be inspired with the belief that life is a great and noble calling, not a mean and grovelling thing that we are to shuffle through as we can, but an elevated and lofty destiny. If ever there was somebody who understood the down-to-earthiness of a life that is also shot through with moments of transfiguration, then it was the amazing youth pastor Mike Yaconelli, who is sadly no longer with us. He likened the Christian life to a ride on a modern death-defying roller coaster. And this is what he said.
So when you get in that thing, a big thing comes over your head, it hooks under your armpits, then another computerized thing comes over, goes, boom. You go, I'm going to die, I haven't even left yet. And you start up that thing, and it's about 200 feet high, and as you're going up, you start getting kind of cocky. You know, yeah, all right, this is not that high. What's the big deal? And then they have a little flat thing right at the top that kind of fakes you out because you think you're over the hill. And so you get up there and go, what is the big, ah! And for the next 40 seconds, it's like, thump, you're done. Now that, to me, is the Christian life. I want to be the roller coaster. You say yes to Jesus, he goes, okay, I'm going to die. That's right. You start going to Sunday school, church, Jesus cheers, give me a J, give me an E. Woo, yeah, I love Jesus. Oh, yeah. Oh, man, I love following God. This is really good. Ah! Next 40 years, you're dead. You know what, folks? If I was to die right now, have a heart attack, I hope I'd have just enough wind left in my lungs as I fell to the ground to look at every one of you and go, what a ride. God, what a ride this has been. That ought to be the gospel. We're not just little nice people that run around. Hi, I'm Nice Mike. No, we're people who have gotten something that has so taken a hold of us that every minute we're living it out. Somebody put it this way. Robert Benson said, too many of us die with half the music left in us. Oh, my God. And if you're in an urban area, if you're in poverty, then you die with so much of the music left in you. And the gospel is about singing and playing all that music out.
God bless you. Amen.